Let us welcome Mr. Munir Daair. By now, you know that he is a prolific speaker and a writer on conflict and conflict dimensions and international politics. He's currently on exile from Yemen, travels between Turkey and the Middle East, and currently he is in Canada. He has been very kind to address you on the issues pertaining to that part of the world where Syrian crisis, Yemen crisis, and other crises are there and leading to human catastrophe. And it is a rare privilege to get Mr. Dai to come and speak to you. And I think this is an extreme, for me at least, it's a rare privilege to get him to come and speak to you. He has an incredibly busy schedule for sure. His insights are quite useful, and I'm quite sure his insights will help you in refining, redesigning, and rethinking your career that is down the lane. With that note, Munir, up to you.
Thank you, Professor Shahab. I'm not so sure I deserve all those nice words, but I'll take them anyway. Shahab and I go many years, I think about 13 or 14 years when we first met in Istanbul, Turkey, in a think tank gathering appropriately called Rebalancing, titled Rebalancing. And I think we met again in Sri Lanka on the same kind of gathering. And all the time trying to make sense of the crazy world around us. I hope you have succeeded, Shahab. I know I haven't. which makes this conversation all the more important. But before I start, I'd like to make a couple of points. First, I would like to start our conversation by providing a historical context to the current situation, which can then perhaps lead us to a conversation about ways we can overcome the problems caused by that history. Second, the title of this talk is Syrian and Yemen Refugee Crisis and International Migration. Now, to confine ourselves to Syria and Yemen, as though the problem is exclusive to those two countries, and relate that problem only to the Arab Spring, would ignore the fact that the problem is much wider than Syria and Yemen, and much older than the Arab Spring. Such a view, I think, will mean we are falling into the same old trap of compartmentalizing integrated problems by trying to delink them, something that only serves to dilute our understanding of the real problem. In a sense, it would be like seeing the trees for the forest. Why start with history? Because looking at the Middle East today and all its complex issues, wars, migration, political crisis, economic crisis, it can be daunting to try and understand the situation in that part of the world without understanding the historical context. The crises we see today in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere were not born at the dawn of the Arab Spring. Indeed, the Arab Spring itself is the culmination of that history. Arguably, the Arab Spring has been in the making for at least 100 years of the region's colonial history, and most probably much longer, brewed by the forceful exportation and exploitation of the region's native religions to global culturally alien habitats, and most certainly by the curse of the region's wealth and region's geographical location. That's quite a mishmash of events and realities that have conspired to create the region's current state of affairs. Take migration through the Mediterranean Sea, for instance. The prevailing narratives in the media and think tanks see what's happening in isolation. Many ignore the fact that this is not the first time people have crossed the Mediterranean seeking to migrate. The difference is that today, those migrating through the Mediterranean northwards are armed only with their employment credentials, hoping to find jobs and livelihood. Their fellow migrants 100 years earlier, who crossed the same Mediterranean southwards, came armed with weapons of war and a desire to colonize lands, plunder wealth, and enslave natives. Indeed, gun-toting, scary armed men invading nations and kicking down doors didn't start with the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq. But perhaps the best place to start would be to critique the very name used to describe the place we are discussing today, the Middle East, and how this moniker came to be. I avoid as much as I can the use of the term Middle East because it's something that doesn't actually mean anything. It is a term that is used to loosely describe a vaguely defined region whose perimeters keep changing. I mean, just try to Google Middle East and see how many different maps turn up. The goalpost always seems to keep changing depending on by whom and for what political agenda the term is used. This is because the term itself is not native to the region, but rather a colonial or Western invention, first coined by the British India Office, then made famous by an American military general. And of course, we can be sure between the two Anglo-Saxon powers and their successors, they couldn't agree on what the perimeters of their Middle East domain was or still is. Today, if I were to ask the identity of an Arab from West Asia, that is the Arabian Peninsula, he will probably identify as an Arab or Middle Eastern, but he will be hard put to acknowledge or even recognize his Asian identity. Entire people and nations have been carved out into artificial domains whose purpose is to split them apart and rule them as small entities. The same is true for those carved out of Africa and clubbed into the same Middle East, or the more recent fanciful but similarly loosely defined acronym MENA, Middle East and North Africa. Now, talking about names and terminology might seem to be academic or even pedantic, but the creation of artificial regions on the map has served as the basis of colonial interventions that have divided the region in very artificial and consequential ways. And those divisions have impacts to this very day, not only when it comes to the issue of migration, but all kinds of other political problems as well. Let me give you a brief example. Up until this end of the World War I, and before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, people throughout the Arabian Peninsula and Levant could travel freely throughout the region. In fact, you could go from Istanbul in Turkey to Medina in present-day Saudi Arabia without passing border checks. But that freedom of movement, which people had enjoyed for centuries, came to an abrupt and violent end through the region's colonial conquests. The most famous or notorious manifestation of that colonialism being the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. In that case, two diplomats, one British, one French, literally drew a line with their pen across the region and created countries at random. That line was drawn across nations, splitting communities, tribes, clans, and families. Anyone who looks at the border of the Arabian Peninsula or North Africa today will easily see how strange and unnatural they seem. The pen and ruler of Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot are evident through the unnaturally angled borderlines of artificial states. In fact, Mr. Mark Sykes, the British diplomat, is reported to have said, "I should like to draw a line from the E in Akka to the last K in Kirkuk. These two cities, Akka and Kirkuk, are 1,000 kilometers apart. That E in Akka is in Palestine, and the K in Kirkuk is in Iraq." That was how easy it was to divide and conquer people. That was how easy it was to uproot and displace people. That was how easy it was to create new refugees who are fleeing the consequences of those divisions to this very day, 100 years later. Another key development that explains the crisis we see today was the rise of Arab nationalism. Now, nationalism in the Arab world grew in the 20th century like it did in other parts of the world. But while nationalism became a way to overthrow colonial subjugation in other parts of the world, in Arab countries, it was often co-opted as a way to solidify colonial control of the region and to legitimize the rule of local dictatorships. An example of what I'm saying is T.E. Lawrence, famously known as Lawrence of Arabia. Glorified as a hero, with films made about him. Even his motorcycle is glorified in the Imperial War Museum in London. He is often portrayed as that selfless British military officer who helped Arabs free themselves from Ottoman control. In fact, what he did was simply to hand over Arab lands from Ottoman control to Western colonial control. By cutting the Arabian Peninsula from the center of the Ottoman Empire, colonial powers were able to easily carve it up among themselves and to exploit the region to their benefit. It was T.E. Lawrence who personally led the group that blew up the train track connecting Istanbul to Medina and the cities in between, used to bring together families and commerce without borders. That act of terrorism didn't win T.E. Lawrence a prison sentence. Instead, it won him a medal and a statue of glorification in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Egypt's Jamal Abdel Nasser, glorified as a revolutionary Arab hero, in fact, founded the corrupt military dictatorships that took hold in many Arab countries, from Libya to Yemen, from Sudan to Iraq. Regimes which have plundered wealth, waged destructive wars, and created generations of disenfranchised youth whose only prospect to this day remains finding a way to leave home. Like Lawrence, who is celebrated for his wrongs, Nasser too is celebrated despite his many wrongs. In fact, we can argue that the Arab Spring and the wars we see today, with all the miseries and refugees and migration created, are directly related in a major way to that part of the region's history in which these two men, T.E. Lawrence and Jamal Abdel Nasser, played a pivotal role in influencing the course of the region's history, current affairs. How do we address this now? How to change? There is a desperate need for reform on a global scale. And no one is better equipped to lead this reform or has a greater stake in reforming than the youth. First, unless you, the youth, those most invested in the future, take possession of the future, nothing will change. In today's world, the nations that determine the course of the future are governed by those who will not be part of that future, who will be dead long before that future arrives. What I'm saying will not win me friends among my age group. But the reality is, my generation has screwed up and done so very badly that we should not be allowed anyway within 1,000 miles of the driver's seat. And yet we are in it and you are out of it. The world's future is being decided by those who will not be alive to experience and suffer the disasters they are creating today. And you who own the future, who will live in that future, are disenfranchised from it and are denied possession of it. The result is that the problems cannot be addressed. Secondly, only the youth who are invested in a balanced and equitable world can understand and have the incentive to rebalance the existing inequity. You cannot claim that you must protect your borders against people moving from the south, but then ignore that northern forefathers came from the north to plunder and enslave the south. When you look, especially those in Europe, when you look at those who are arriving on your shores, you must recognize that they are here because you were there. And that imbalance has not been fixed. Reparations have not been acknowledged. The bill is still unpaid. And unless that is settled, no formal colonial masters have the right to deny access to former colonial enslaved people. Former colonial masters can spend billions trying to keep people off their shores. It has not succeeded. It will not succeed. In fact, maybe it should not be allowed to succeed. You cannot plunder other nations, use robbed resources to build your prosperity, then deny your victims the right to that prosperity. Why have I given this history lesson? Because you need to understand that history to understand where we are today and why we are here today. It's not just a simple problem of migration or refugees. There's much more issues involved behind it. So much commentary today sees the Arab Spring and what is happening there, Yemen, Syria, maybe Libya, and think about all these things in a vacuum without thinking about the history that preceded it. As if all our problems started with Syria, Yemen, and the Arab Spring in 2011. I will be 70 years old in January. I was 10 years old the first time I saw a human being shot dead. I was also 10 years old the first time an angry militiaman pointed his machine gun at my head. I was 12 years old the second time I saw a man shot dead. and had a soldier from the British colonial army use his rifle butt to hit my back. I was 10 years old when my family was hiding from battles raging outside. Within 3 years, at the age of 13, again I had to hide with my family behind bedroom walls, fearing bullets from the battles raging outside. Those events were lived through by one family, but not in one country. People's miseries were not confined to one country. Over the next 60 years of my life, political events and wars dictated where and how I lived, and how I view governments and politics. And I am one of the lucky ones. I never had to live and grow up in a refugee camp or become a displaced person with a threatened survival. Hundreds of thousands, millions are not so lucky. Yet, whenever we reach a point where we believe we have found the ability to restart a life of continued peace and harmony, of continued stability and prosperity, we are awakened with yet another political upheaval, yet another invasion, yet another civil war. And as I look at the children and youth around today in the Arab world, I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. I see only things are going to get worse. Today, Arabs represent 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's refugees. And we own the richest real estate on the planet. As I listen to some of my Western friends telling us, why don't you move on from your colonial past? My question to them is, when will you allow us to do so, please? How can you possibly move on from a past that is still very much your present? How can you move on from a past that continues to haunt your present in a very destructive way? The Mediterranean Sea is evidence of how much our past is haunting our present. Babies are dying trying to cross, and refugees are dying there every day by the thousands over the years. That's our present. That was also our past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Munir. That was absolutely eye-opening, and I think we have a lot of questions pending for you. So I will start with Jasper, and then Braden, and then Tyler. Jasper.
So,
Can you hear Jasper?
hello.
Yes, I can, I think. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for that history lesson. I really love the kind of parallel that you made between Europeans crossing the Mediterranean with arms in order to conquer lands. And then now, since that happened, the reverse is happening, but people are crossing northbound, rather not to conquer, but for safety. And then you also spoke, so, okay.
Good.
In order to kind of keep this going, like in Europe and America, there's this narrative of fear of migrants, whether or not the migrants are dangerous or won't work or something, this, that, and the other. How as a global population, how do we get rid of those narratives?
Okay, so Munir, before you start, Braden. Can you see Braden?
Yes, he's waving. I'm waving back to him. So you want me to listen to 3 questions and then answer them, or question answer?
3 questions and then you answer them.
Okay.
You opened your talk about some terminology about the Middle East and how maybe terms like that deprive residents there of, I think you said, of their Asian identity. Is there some sort of alternate language or terminology that you think would be preferable that maybe we could use as opposed to Middle East or Middle East and North Africa?
So it's basically challenging the term Middle East. And Mia?
Oh, I thought that was.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you see any evidence of global reform becoming more feasible with our generation. I know you mentioned that our generation has, more hope, but I was wondering if you have any specific evidence of us.
Can the third question? I can't. It's not very clear for me.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if you see any evidence of global reform within our generation, like our generation.
Right.
Okay.
Very interesting questions.
Interesting, very interesting 3 questions. Very interesting. Anti-immigration narratives, how to challenge them. I think one of the things that people don't seem to realize in the countries that are receiving refugees or immigrants, go back to their lives, you will find that these are people who have had their schools, they have had their supermarkets, their jobs, kids were playing in their own playgrounds. Families are visiting each other over dinners. These are not people who are coming to invade somebody. These are victims of an invasion themselves. And they are being looked at in a way that is totally different from the reality of their life. They are being dehumanized, not because they are inhuman, but because they are the victims of inhumanity. When we are able to bring that narrative to the public domain, that these are normal people who have had their lives disrupted. And I have seen it myself. I mean, I have lived in that part of the world. I have neighbors and I have friends who we are trying in as much as we can to help rebuild their lives. And we can see what kind of lives they have today. And we know what kind of lives they had before the war started. So when you see a Syrian refugee in Turkey or in Germany, or an Iraqi refugee in Europe or in the States, don't look at that refugee as some kind of an usurper who has come here to claim something that belongs to you, but he has lost something that you still have. That is why he's here. His first choice would be to be home, among his people, in the land he understands, in a culture he was brought up with. That's his first choice, but he doesn't have that choice. Now, let me look at the second question as soon as I can. Okay. Terminology about Middle East. Well, we don't need terminology to create a new terminology about Middle East. There is a part of that is part of Asia. I mean, if the country I'm currently living in, part of it is in Europe, part of it is in Asia. Now, that part of Asia is called in the Middle East. West Asian countries of the Arab world, these are Asian countries. Why do we need to give a new name to them? Why do we need to give an African part of Africa, cut it out of Africa and call it part of the Middle East? This is Africa. This is your ethnicity can be Arab or whatever, but you're part of an African continent. So the need to call an alternative name war doesn't arise. Just Asia is Asia, Africa is Africa, Europe is Europe, the Americas are Americas. There is no need to carve out people and give them new titles. Now, evidence of reform among younger generation, yes, that I can see those attempts were tried in the Arab world. Arab Spring is evidence of those attempts. Unfortunately, it has not succeeded. It became an Arab something else. But the effort has to continue. I personally think that if the youth do not become much more and more engaged in how the world is run at individual nations and even a coalition, international coalition of youth, to take control of the world, and the world is left in the hands of the type of leadership we see today, there is no hope of reform. The only hope of reform is there if those who have the highest stake are engaged in that reform. Otherwise, no hope.
Thank you, Munir.
It's you guys.
So it's Tyler, and then Nancy, and then Charles. Tyler.
Hi. So I really enjoyed your quote where you talked about how your generation has screwed up and shouldn't be within, I think you said 1,000 miles of the driver's seat. However, they still find themselves in the driver's seat, and the youth seems to be the farthest from it. That's kind of stuck with me. And so going on to my question, what do you think it would take for an entire generation to own up and make dues for the mistakes of their past in order for the younger generation to then step in and try to help make a solution? Do you think it's feasible for an entire generation to try to own up to the history, or do you think it's something that doesn't necessarily have to be done in order for the new generation to step up and try to come up with solutions?
Okay. Nancy,
In regards to, like, you mentioned.
can you listen to Nancy?
Yes, I can hear.
In regards to the refugee camps that you mentioned, I know a bunch of people are coming from the Mediterranean and they're like getting stuck into camps. Do you think that, like, the conditions of, like, the way they're being received, is it getting better, or is it progressively getting worse because there's just more and more people coming in?
And the last question is from
Yeah.
Charles.
Yeah, in your presentation.
Can you hear Charles?
I'm trying.
Charles is from Ghana, so
Yeah,
Okay. Ghana.
my question is, in your submission, you mentioned that you have been lucky not to have grown up in a refugee camp, having gone through some of those same experiences. Can you share with us briefly how you got lucky not to have grown in a refugee camp? Maybe that would be lessons for maybe some other people too.
So simply, Munir, why you are not a refugee?
Hmm.
Go ahead. That's a brilliant question from Charles.
Yeah. Good thing it's in the third question. Okay. First question, Tyler. All generations screwed up and disenfranchised. What does it take for the new generation? Let me give you a simple example. Not simple, but quite a serious example, Tyler. During the Second World War, millions were killed. I mean, we're talking here about 30, 40 million. I don't remember the number anymore. But there is an incident in the Second World War that stands out, that moves us in a very, very strong way. It's called the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is not a situation where we say people were killed, there were 40 million people killed. Why are we crying for this? The reason we are moved by the Holocaust is because those people were exterminated because of their ethnicity, because of their religious background. That is what moves us, that there is a group of people simply because of their ethnicity and religious background, they were exterminated. Now, King Leopold of Belgium murdered, under his rule, murdered 10 million Congolese. I don't know how many schools in the United States or Western Europe has in their school books a record of these murders. The Holocaust victims are still, until 2023, being compensated. Germany is paying reparations. The Belgians have not even been willing to acknowledge until recently the crime, let alone the reparations. And the Congolese were also murdered because of their ethnicity and their background. Two people we have here who were 10 million in Congo, 6 million in Germany. Both these two people were exterminated because of their ethnicity. Yet one has the recognition and reparations, the other one doesn't even have acknowledgement. There is a mindset problem here, Tyler. And unless we can overcome this mindset, and this mindset is historical. If we look forward and I look at the young people around, I find promise that the young people in the States or in Europe do not look at the African in Africa with the way that forefathers did. We are moving ahead. So we need to change. We need to question ourselves in many ways why we think the way we think. Reform starts from the mind. And then once that mind, we start educating ourselves that it's not about color, it's not about ethnicity, it's not about religion, it's about humanity. When we are able to cross over, then we will be able to have a chance for reform. Nancy, refugee camps conditions, better or worse? Well, it depends on what you're comparing it with, really, isn't it? I mean, if you're comparing a refugee camp in Turkey or in Lebanon with the events in Syria or in Yemen, the war, where there is a shooting war and there is a blockade, people cannot find even baby milk in Yemen with a blockade. There is a massive blockade of the whole of Yemen by big ships from superpowers. If you're comparing refugee camp with that, then of course the refugee camp wins. But if you're comparing refugee camps with what these refugees had before they became refugees, then certainly refugee camps can come nowhere near comparing to what they were living. So it really depends on what it is compared with. How are you feeling luckier? How are you feeling luckier? Charles, I think the fact that luckily I had a family network. You know, we have a family network that is able to reach out in practical ways to different parts of the world where our family is located and help. That is the source of my luck. But I can imagine that if I was not in that way, I mean, I was born in East Africa. You are coming from Ghana. We are neighbors. I was born in East Africa, and I grew up and studied in Yemen, and then immigrated to somewhere else. So I had those opportunities, and in the midst of that opportunity, we went. Our family went through wars, but we could have very well been one of those refugees, except for the fact that we were lucky enough to have a family network that is able to reach out and help and offer the support that is needed. Those who don't have that, unfortunately, end up in refugee camps.
I have two more questions to take. One is from Jake. Jake, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So it's Jake and then Favor. So we're left with two questions. Jake.
Okay, so in the beginning, you mentioned that a lot of borders in these West Asian countries were drawn arbitrarily by European powers. Do you think these borders will change in the future to reflect more realistic divisions of the cultures in these regions?
Favor? Favor, are you there? Okay, Anya has one more question. Jasper.
Okay. So you've referenced this a lot about how you think that the youth has, I guess, a lot of promise. What you don't, in my point of view, like, in my opinion, I feel like we may end up making the same mistakes. That generation after generation, this has always happened, so why wouldn't we do the same? So what makes you still think that we have promise?
In the book.
Oh, and also, oh, I'm sorry. And also, so you are writing a book. Could you tell us more about that?
Okay. Arbitrary borders, will they be changed? Well, if you see that in the past, well, during my lifetime, wars have been happening in that region because people have been trying to change borders or rechange them, redesign them, rewrite them. And that is a continuous process. I mean, all these wars that you see, some of them between Iraq and Iran, between Libya and Chad, and so on, Morocco and the Sahara. I mean, you've got so many wars going on. We have had the same situation in Yemen some years ago with Oman, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. It's all been an attempt to change these borders. Are those attempts now going to be fruitious? I think ultimately we will have new borders depending on the powerful states that are emerging in the region. They will create new situations eventually, but will it be a border of coexistence, or will it be a border of a front line to a front line waiting for the opportunity to reclaim territory? That's probably going to happen. So really, I mean, the situation, the border problem is going on over many decades now, and it will continue. Youth has a lot of prime. What gives you promise? Well, I think that there is a changing attitude among the youth that is being brought about by technology, by the communication that is, I mean, 60 years ago when I was a child, it was very difficult to communicate with a fellow kid on the other side of the globe. It was almost impossible to do that. Today, all you need to do is press a couple of buttons. So the ability to integrate mentally, the opportunity to integrate mentally, and the ability to integrate even across languages. Now we have even tools that can overcome some of our language problems. We are getting closer and closer. The idea of a global village is becoming truer and truer every day. And that communication, that ability to transport oneself from one area to another, to actually experience the life and livelihood of others and the cultures of others, offers a lot of promise, which was not available to us 60, 50 years ago. It is available to you. Today, how much time do you need to get off from that seat you're sitting there and fly to China? It's a matter of hours. How much time do you need to talk to your Chinese counterpart? It's a couple of seconds. That, if that does not offer you the opportunity of integrating and understanding and changing your views about one another, nothing will. And that's one of the sources of my hope. Writing a book, well, it is a personal story. It's a book about two people. A 70-year-old man, and I don't need to tell you who that is, but that's the factual part. And a 12-year-old kid, a girl. And I try to track their lives until they meet, at the time of their meeting. And basically the message that I'm trying to convey in this book is that over the past 6 years, things haven't changed. I lived through the same kind of tragedy that the child is living today. 60 years later, you meet a child who is going through exactly, or even worse, because of the power of technology, in fact, worse than the way his grandfather or her grandfather's generation lived. That's the message of the book. But I'm trying to track into that the lives of individuals who are affected at a micro level. I mean, it is easy for us to hear carpet bombing somewhere, so economic sanctions another place, things like that happening. But what actually happens on the ground, the people who are there, how do their lives change? And perhaps in the book, I'm trying to portray that. Thank you.
Thank you, Munir. On behalf of the class, Anya will just express her gratitude to you, and Tyler will also do that.
Yes, thank you so much. Dr. Shahid said that you're very busy, so thank you so much for finding time to come and speak with us. I know that for me, a lot of what you said has opened my mind a bit, and kind of helped me realize a few things. So I appreciate that.
Tyler?
Kind of like what was just said, I think we all really appreciate your time that you gave to us today. And I think that it's really hopeful and inspiring how much hope that you have for the future. Even though you've gone through some of the worst tragedies somebody can experience, you still, you still have hope for the future and for our generation. So it kind of motivates me, and I know the rest of the class can agree that it definitely motivates them to try and make a change for some of these problems.
Thank you. If I manage to inspire even a little bit of that, then maybe everything makes everything worth it. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, the rest of the group there, and thank you, Shahab. We will meet again. I hope.
I hope I'll catch up with you as a follow-up in a day or two, if it is okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Please do. Please do. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.